On behalf of Understanding Ag and the Soil Health Academy, we'd like to welcome everyone this evening to the cover crop planting decisions. This is going to be a webinar specifically towards looking at cover crops within your operations. This is a question and answer webinar this evening. So please type your answers in so they can be answered. Many of the partners are on this evening, along with several of our consultants, so we can draw upon their expertise to answer your questions. But there's a few things we need to probably talk about, when we're making cover crop decisions. One of the biggest ones is, what are your resource concerns? I mean, that's the first question you need to ask yourself. That could be a multitude of different things. And David, would you like to go ahead and proceed with those?
Yeah, and real quick, before I start with all of that as well, you can type in your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. There's also an option to raise your hand, and if you do that, we'll see that you have a question. We can call on you then to unmute yourself and ask it as well. So when we're addressing some of our resource concerns, we got to think about, what is it that we're after? Is it to get armor on that soil? Do we want to improve nutrient cycling? Are we wanting to add carbon into that soil system? Improve our water infiltration, control erosion? Do we need forage for livestock? And is that going to be hayed or grazed? Because that can be, different mixes there that we design around. Do we want some pollinator habitat? Are we looking for weed suppression? And another thing we need to think about that, Shane, we didn't include on here, but we need to think about what has been applied this year so far as herbicides as well. So, thinking about from, the burn down, the pre-plant residuals to the post-emergent residual herbicides that could have some effect on a cover crop species that we're going to think about putting into our mixes.
That's a great comment, David. Checking to make sure restrictions on anything planting before we go out here and we spend the money and take the time to plant a cover crop, that those are addressed. We need to add carbon to our soil. That's the bottom line. I think as consultants, when we're out in the fields and we're looking at a lot of these different soils for clients and other individuals are doing schools, probably the number one resource concern we can address is adding more carbon to our soil. Because we're dealing with the biology in the soil. And this is something we probably haven't acknowledged well enough, definitely in agriculture, is we're dealing with a living system. And like any living system, it's required something to eat on a daily basis, 24/7. And its primary food source is carbon, along with nitrogen. But this is a good illustration of one eyedropper underneath the microscope. And you can see there's hundreds of small bacteria, spread throughout this view, along with some fungal strand. So we got to remember, we're dealing with a living system within our soils. And with those living systems, they need a food supply. And carbon is one of the major ones. And David, would you like to talk about a little bit about our carbon and nitrogen, how we determine carbon and nitrogen ratios?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if we look at this chart, at the center of the chart is the ideal microbial diet, and that's at 24:1. So when we're thinking about designing our cover crop mixes for our next cash crop, we have to understand, what that crop nutrient needs are. So for instance, a legume like a soybean, excuse me, doesn't require a lot of, we don't have to apply nitrogen fertilizer to that crop. And actually, if we can take a lot of that excess nitrate nitrogen out of that soil system and, tie it up into a grass cover crop such as rye or triticale or oats or wheat or anything like that, then, it's going to take longer for it to decompose and it's going to tie it up. Whereas if we were to look at like a corn or a milo or some of them grass species that require a lot more nitrogen, then we have to look at, adding in some of these other legumes to balance that diet, basically that soil system. So we don't want to have a carbon to nitrogen ratio too high going in front of corn if our systems are not mature enough to handle that, because it'll tie up a lot of nitrogen, and then we'll end up having to apply more fertilizer to offset that. So if we're looking at this chart and the ideal microbial diet is 24-1, anything above that 24-1 can basically, it slows down the decomposition rate of that cover crop. And anything below that 24-1 is going to mineralize it out relatively quickly and release those nutrients. Now, one of the things, Shane, when we're talking about carbon and adding carbon into the soil, a lot of guys will think about, especially, in a forage type, if they're using it for maybe a haylage or baleage or anything like that, or grazing it and grazing it all out, is that they think, well, I've still got these roots in the soil and that's still good, right? But then I terminate the cover crop when it's just a few inches tall. Well, that's fine, but just like you and I, when we come home at night, we like to go into our house that has 4 good walls to protect ourselves from the wind. It's got a roof on it to protect ourselves from the rain. And it's got a layer of insulation that helps protect ourselves from the temperature changes, whether it's too cold or too hot. So putting that armor on that soil and getting it covered is really important. And that's a huge part of this mineralization as well. A cover crop that's sitting up in the air isn't going to break down nearly as quickly as that cover crop that is actually right on the soil surface.
Absolutely, David. The cover is extremely important, and getting this immobilization and mineralization process started so we're cycling nutrients. And one thing we've got to acknowledge, all these soil microbiome or microbiology within the soil, work on the films of water within the soil. That's how they have their mobility. But this is kind of how the nitrogen mineralization process occurs. We got to think of these bacteria. They're basically packed full of nutrients. I mean, they've got a carbon to nitrogen ratio of a 5-1. But we need something. Those nutrients are now immobilized within the bodies of these bacteria. And the only way we're going to cycle those nutrients back out is to have predators, such as this nematode, coming along and consuming that bacteria. His carbon to nitrogen ratio is a 10-1. So he's going to have to utilize 2 of these bacteria to meet his carbon needs. And what's he going to do with the excess nitrogen? He only needs 1 part. That excess nitrogen is going to be put back into the soil in a form the plant can utilize and be cycled back, going from immobilization, which is in the bacteria, being mineralized through the nematode, and now becoming plant available nitrogen. And we talk a lot about management for nitrogen retention. And David, you'd like to spend more on this photo?
Yeah, so when you're looking at this photo, there's, it appears to be, a heavy cereal cover crop mix. And, it appears that it would be corn or maybe milo or some type of the grass growing in those rows. And so that's a high carbon, low nitrogen cover crop there. Even though it might be just wheat, because the size of it's pretty short. So I'm going to say, it could be wheat or maybe barley, but probably wheat by the heads. And so that cover crop is going to tie up a lot of nitrogen. So what ends up happening is we've got a lot of bacteria in there that, they have a 5-1, maybe a 3-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And we've got a lot of carbon there, but, not a lot of nitrogen to help break that process down, mineralize it out. So we end up with a lot of this nitrogen just tied up in into the bodies of those bacteria as well. And that's why it's really important to build, as we're looking at building our soil health, to understand the benefits of nematodes and fungi and protozoa and even worms and other arthropods in that soil that are consuming and the soils and the microbes and everything else in there, and helping to cycle these nutrients back out. As we get more advanced into our soil health and we see our CO2 respiration rates really increase, we will want to actually have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio going to maybe corn, because our microbes will consume our residues really quickly as that CO2 respiration increases and we have more microbial activity. So, it's going to be kind of a balance of how we start and where we end.
Absolutely. David, one thing we don't acknowledge enough is 90% of nutrients plants take up are microbially mediated. And I mean, it's got to go through the biology first. And we don't take an account for that. And a common myth about inorganic fertilizers, they feed the plant directly. And you want to address that a little bit more about the fertilizers, what's actually happening?
Yep, we think that, we apply a fertilizer and that's going to be 100% available to that plant. Well, in reality, that plant's only able to take up about 10% of that directly. And then the other 90% has to go through a microbe's gut to be able to be utilized by that plant. But we also have to understand, especially with like phosphorus and potassium, that some of these nutrients and other nutrients besides that, but let's just pick on phosphorus, for instance, up to 80% of phosphorus can be tied up in the soil colloid as well. So only 20% of what we apply might be available to that plant that year. So where's the rest of it going? Well, depending on our erosion or rainfall and everything else, it could end up in the Gulf of Mexico, or it could just be locked up in organic forms into that soil. And by having these cover crops of diverse mixes and having these different microbes in there, we can start to release and cycle these. And the diversity is really important because different plants will release different root exudates to feed different microbial communities in that soil profile in exchange for nutrients. And depending on, the carbon to nitrogen ratio of that plant, how fast it breaks down and mineralizes, will determine how much of that will be able to be cycled and get back into the soil in an inorganic form that the plants can utilize as well.
Great points, David. One thing we need to maybe emphasize is when we go put nitrogen out there, it's the biology. Remember, there's billions and billions of soil microbes in a teaspoon of healthy soil, and their affinity for nitrogen is pretty high demand. And who's going to capture it first? It's going to be the biology. And the only way we're going to capture a lot of that nutrient back is through the immobilization, mineralization process of having predators in our soils, helping cycle nutrients back that can now become plant available again. So, David, we've got one question here. It says, I am wondering if the same happens to the minerals we provide to cattle. How much of this is actually feed to the cow? And David, I'll let you speak on it, but I know Dr. Williams is on the line this evening, and I'll allow Dr. Williams to finish it up here.
Yeah, the same thing between the cattle mineral and the, what mineral forms the plants or that's in the soil as well. You've got reduced and oxidized forms. And, there's a lot of those minerals that just basically pass right through. It's kind of like when we take a vitamin, you can basically tell later in the day if you're absorbing that nutrient or not. And it's the same with cattle, with a lot of the minerals out there. It's the same with the plants. So, there's a lot of that. There's different grades, I guess, when you're looking at prices as well. So cheap mineral or cheap input, and you might not be getting much out of it as well.
Alan.
Yes, that the worst form of a mineral that you can buy in terms of actual gut absorption of the individual minerals are minerals that are in oxide form. So if you buy minerals, it's zinc oxide, ferrous oxide, so on and so forth. So look at the mineral itself, and then right behind the name of that mineral, magnesium, manganese, zinc, calcium, whatever, it will also state the form that it's in. And oxides are the form of most minerals, especially the cheaper minerals that are sold out there. Because the oxide form of a mineral is the cheapest mineral out there. But the problem is your cattle are consuming that and then squirting out the vast majority of it right out their rear end back out on the ground. So really, you're mineralizing the soil and not providing a lot of mineral to the cow itself. So you've got to pay attention to that. The truth is, we're typically far better off working on our soil health and the mineral cycle in the soil than we are being too overly concerned about feeding mineral. Initially, you may feed mineral, but what you'll find is that if you're moving them every day and you're paying close attention to mineral consumption, is that as you improve your soils, mineral consumption will go down. But the other thing that you'll see is the difference from pasture to pasture. You'll notice that some are improving from a soil microbial standpoint more rapidly than other by the mineral consumption of your cattle when they're in that pasture. So in feeding a mineral, though, a sulfate form like ferrous sulfate, zinc sulfate, that type of thing has better absorbability. The chelated minerals have yet another higher level of absorbability, but they are quite expensive to feed. So you have to be aware of that, but always check the tag. And if you have an issue or are not sure about a mineral, if you want to shoot the tag to me, a picture of the tag, I would be very happy to help you evaluate it.
Yeah, and another point there too, like Alan had mentioned, is, as your soils improve, but if you're moving your cattle daily and improving the diversity of their diet as far as different plant species, like I'd mentioned earlier, those different plant species are going to take up different minerals as well. So as the cows are nipping on a little bit of everything in there and not just hammering one plant species that they really like, and everything becomes more competition, you'll definitely see your mineral consumption go down as they're getting more of that mineral into their gut.
Yeah, those are all great comments. One thing we also need to focus on is, it all goes back to epigenetics and finding the animals and individuals and know how to select for their diets and work within the systems. And as we said, we need diversity within our systems so those animals can select those diets and they can express their epigenetics. Next question. Far South Indiana, breed corn with roller crimper termination for erosion and weed control mix. What would you say about a mix of 30 pounds cereal rye, 20 pounds triticale, 5 pounds hairy veg, 5 pounds balanza clover, 10 pounds winter peas, and 5 pounds radish? David, I'm gonna allow you, then if Gabe's available, I'm gonna have Gabe follow up on this too.
Yeah, so number one, I would pull back on that radish quite a bit. 5 pounds is a tremendous amount of radish in there, but then I would also want to know, how is it being seeded? If you're broadcasting it or flying it on, or are you drilling it in? The other thing I'd want to know is, I really would like to know what your CO2 respiration rate is, what your Haney test is telling us, to know how to balance that, because I would pull back on, especially the 5 pounds of balanza clover. To be honest with you, with cereal rye, I do not see much expression of balansa clover in mixes. Where I don't have cereal rye in the mixes, I see a better expression of the balansa clover. And when you're looking at, 5 pounds of veg, 10 pounds of peas, if you were to plant this in South Indiana towards the end of May, you're going to have a tremendous amount of biomass. Okay, so Matt just said he's going to drill it. So definitely pull back on the radish. I would probably tweak this a little bit, as far as cereal rye goes into this with the triticale. But with the veg, in peas, you're going to have a tremendous amount of nitrogen there, which can, depending on how advanced your system is, if you're just getting started, really, lower carbon and nitrogen to, kind of spur things along, but then you're basically pouring gasoline onto a fire with that, the amount of carbon in there with the cereal rye trit, or if you just increase the trit or maybe switch it up to maybe a bob oat or something like that, could provide some lasting residue. I just fear that, you might be too low and end up, especially if the balansa did make it through, it'd be too low of carbon to nitrogen ratio. And what that'll actually do is collapse your soil system, because those legumes are, one, they're low carbon to nitrogen ratio. So you've not, you've got the rye and the trit in there, you got the grasses that are providing carbon into that system, but those legumes, they also release nitrogen into that. Let me turn off my video. Let's see if that helps. Do you hear me? Can you still hear me, Shane?
Yes.
Okay. So with those legumes, they're going to be releasing nitrogen as well into that soil profile. And so as those microbes, especially the bacteria, need carbon, the first thing that they're going to go after termination is your soil aggregates. And so they're going to collapse your soil system and make your soils more compacted, and which is going to reduce water infiltration, reduce nutrient cycling. You can have some negative compounding effects there. So yeah, I'd really probably recommend you pull a Haney test first, and then we can talk about more of the specifics on the rates of what should be in there.
I agree with what David had said. Definitely have to cut way back on the radish. Rarely do we recommend more than 2 pounds total of any brassicas in the mix. Also agree on the balansa clover. Bit concerned about having too much legumes in the mix. Do the Haney test and then get back to us, Matt, and we'll be happy to help you with it. Shane, did you freeze up there?
Looks like he did. I thought it was me for a second. Yeah, so in our Q&A, it looks like we've got a question from Edward, who asked, my main objective was foremost first and is increasing water infiltration. That's pretty important that we see that increase in that water infiltration, because like we've talked about, that just helps to increase the soil microbial activity as those microbes live in this subaquatic ecosystem. And same with our insects as well. We got to think about our insects out there that, our beneficial predatory insects, they need that subaquatic ecosystem and they need that armor on the soil. So making sure that we keep that soil covered, that is the quickest way to help build that aggregate, stable aggregate, and increase the water infiltration. And like we've been mentioning, we got to balance that carbon to nitrogen ratio so we're not collapsing that soil profile. Got another question here from Jason. He says, what would you predict would happen to the soil of a corn on corn field used for silage with the stalks regularly baled and replaced with bed pack manure from a cattle confinement barn with conventional tillage for 5 years in a row. We're going to get soil testing done later in August, but this is the way one of our fields has been operated. Gabe, you look like you're chomping at the bit right now.
Well, seeing as how I saw the field, yeah, I will comment on that. It's typical. Producers tend to think that if they do remove silage, they can go back in and apply manure and it will negate the negative effects of removing silage. And that's just not so. Realize corn does have very good root biomass. So you're doing some good there, but you're still going to be very short of carbon. Long term, there is zero doubt that that field is slowly degrading over time. Probably don't realize it because of just being there doing the same thing year after year. But water infiltration rates will be decreasing. Soil organic matter levels will be decreasing. You will be singly selecting for biology because you don't have the diversity. We need to get diversity into that system. My suggestion would be strongly to go to a series of cover crops. Preferably you could graze them. If you are going to remove them by making haylage out of the covers, at least do that with a cool season mix so that you're getting some diversity. Then plant a warm season mix in there and go with a grazing component, if at all possible, on the warm season mix. David?
Yeah, one of the things that I've started to see on a lot of dairy operations I've been on in Southern Illinois is something similar to this. And with the corn on corn and planting the cover crop, especially just corn on corn, you're selecting the quorums or the groups of microbes that you want to thrive in that soil system. And what happens eventually is you get into this more on approach of farming that you're going to have to apply more fertilizers to sustain yields over time, which is going to deeply cut into profitability. I would highly recommend that you start altering the fields that you're cutting silage on. And, you know, a lot of times guys are taking corn silage off, applying a manure, having that cover crop out there, but then comes springtime, you know, if they can take a cutting off of that, they're going to take a cutting, maybe two. I've seen as many as 3 times, but my goodness, that soil becomes like a rock. And then guys have trouble getting a planter into the ground and everything else. And then they see these negative implications on their corn where their roots just can't get down to access any moisture. And we just created our own droughts because of the amount of compaction out there. So, you know, like Gabe said, you know, try to get something different in there. Make sure we keep soil covered is absolutely critical. So let's see here. Do we have any other questions coming in? I just switched over to presenter view, so I've got change here. So Matt had mentioned that he asked, would a Haney test in September answer enough for October cover planting? Yes, I would say that, you know, if we can get out there in September and pull some Haney samples, and, you know, we send them to Regen Ag Labs is who we recommend. Make sure that you're taking them at a consistent depth of, you know, we take ours generally at 6 inches, but send them off and you'll get that results back within a week generally, and that will provide us enough time. That being said, cover crop supply is going to be an issue this year. So if it were me, I would try to get out there as soon as possible and be pulling those samples so that you can start designing that cover crop mix today instead of waiting until October to say, oh, I need this species, and then all of a sudden you can't find it. But then in the future, typically I like to take the Haney test in the springtime, and I'd be consistent on when I pull that in the spring. Typically I wait till the soil temperature in that upper 2 inches is at least 55 degrees, but 50 to 55 degrees with a warming trend in the forecast, and just start baselining your stuff then, but just be consistent about when you start taking them. That can help you out in making those management decisions for that corn crop or milo crop or whatever at that time.
David, this is Alan.
Yes,
I would
sir.
like to go back for just a moment to the bed pack manure.
Yep.
And also I'm going to ask Kent to comment on that as well. We've been working with quite a few dairies who are dealing with bed pack manure. And one of the things that we now know, and the work of Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, has been really good at revealing this. But if those cattle were fed, basically subtherapeutic antibiotics, feed-grade antibiotics and all of that, or administered therapeutically a lot of antibiotics, then that antibiotic residue is going to be in that bed pack manure. And the research now shows that pretty conclusively. It alters the gut microbial profile of the cattle. And we have found that it also alters the gut microbial profile of dung beetles, earthworms, and other macroorganisms in the soil, as well as harming the microbes in the soil. So a lot of times when we think manure is just great, this bed pack manure or effluents from lagoons and these types of things, we like to think of them as just pure organic matter and carbon, and they're wonderful to put out there. But what we have seen is some very, very severe degradation of the soil and severe negative impact on soil biology and mineral and water cycling. We see soils with lots of manure applied that have incredibly poor infiltration rates and are heavily plated. Kent, would you like to comment?
Yeah, just a couple other things. Pit manure is primarily coming out anaerobic, so it's going to have a very different microbial profile. Also the rate, as Alan alluded to, the rate of application. We're seeing very high rates due to limited acreage in order to get nutrients out in the soil and pushing the envelope there. And these tend to get slugged on with a single application throughout the year. And these very high rates of these anaerobic, from these anaerobic systems are having some real negative effects on our soil profile.
Thank you, Kent and Alan. I think I've got internet connection back, so hopefully we keep it.
Welcome back, Shane.
Well, it's good to be back, David. Cheap internet. Hey, so I got a question here from Clay in central Wisconsin.
Okay.
What are some good cover crop options to interseed into corn silage crop between V3 and V5 that would be beneficial to establishing a hayfield the following year? He says, I have a Gandy seeder mounted on our cultivator. We currently use tillage practices to establish a pea and oat nurse crop underseeded with alfalfa and red clover, located in central Wisconsin, heavy clay soils. So let me take the beginning of this, David, and I'll let you do a follow-up and let anyone else who'd like to address this question answer it also. But, if you're going to try to bring into perennial grass system, we've got to kind of fix the soil microbiome first. So if this is a highly bacterial soil, just by adding maybe one cover crop in there, trying to, build the soil microbiology back up, maybe getting them a little more of a fungal component, it's probably going to take you at least a year or two before you go out here and write the check to start trying to put in perennial grasses. You're probably not going to have a very good stand in the initial beginning, coming off with corn silage and even with the cover crop trying to interseed into. I'd feel a lot more comfortable doing that, maybe a cover crop for a full year, if not two. utilizing both the Haney and PLFA test, the phospholipid fatty acid test, looking to see where our fungal to bacteria ratios are before I start trying to establish any perennial forages into the system.
Yeah, and I was looking at his question here as well, Shane, and the second part he mentions about using a pre-emerge herbicide for broadleaf control after planting. But he's concerned about the herbicide residual stunning the cover crop growth. There's a website, it's interseedingcovers.com. You can go to, and they have a list of residual herbicides that have a short half-life to them, you know, that you could potentially come back in and plant behind. But, you know, the first thing that I would try to do, you know, before you get into the interseeding is really focus on your soil health first, building that armor and trying to control the weeds as much as possible with your cover crop. So instead of using, let's say, a 15-ounce rate of an Outlook or something, maybe you could get by with a 6-ounce, maybe a no herbicide at all, and just using something as a no residual base, basically just a systemic type herbicide to control the weeds that are up. And then that would give you more opportunity to go in there and seed a cover crop, whether that's a, you know, annual ryegrass, perennial rye in his environment. You could probably use oats, maybe even some cereal rye, but you can mix in, you know, different mung beans or cowpeas. Probably avoid sun hemp just because they get pretty tall and stringy going into the machine at harvest time. Buckwheat, you know, flax. I mean, there's a whole host of different species that he could use. It, you know, it would definitely depend on that Haney test, PLFA test, and looking at what herbicides he's using as well.
Hey, Kent, can you follow up?
Yeah, Shane, just to encourage the producer, a lot of producers think that by taking a year and doing a complex cover is a year loss of production. And you know, ideally, if we could graze it, we're going to get the most bang for our buck and quickest ROI on that. But from a biological and forage production standpoint, we see positive levels of forage production for multiple years after doing something like this, and with no additional inputs. So we've got data to support this. Generally 25 to 35% bump in forage production for multiple years. It's not uncommon to see that. So you're going to get a return on your investment for doing this. It's something maybe a little different than what you're used to, but there's some very positive results by doing this.
Great comments, Kent. Thank you. Karen asked, what's UA's position on using sea salt and conditioner to detox cattle? Alan, would you like to address this one?
I guess, Karen, I would like to know more. First of all, what are you calling a conditioner? And secondly, what are you referring to when you're saying you want to detox cattle? I really need just a little more information. So Karen, if you could type in some additional information there, then I'd be happy to address that. And are you talking about, when you say sea salt, are you talking about feeding them C90 or something like that? So please type in some additional information and then we'll address the question.
Thank you, Alan. Andrew's question is.
Hey, real quick, Shane.
Yes, David.
Karen says she's using Redmond Ag products. If that helps, Alan.
Okay. Well, I mean, they're fine. You know, if she's supplementing with Redmond Ag products, the Redmond mineral and sea salt, you know, no issue there. I'm not quite certain about the detoxing and what Karen is really referring to there.
Thank you, Alan. I think we lost Alan on the internet. Next question. Edward asks, so far I have used warm season soil builder mix, which grow to about 8 to 10 foot high before I terminate it. Last fall, I followed with a cool season soil builder mix, which grows from 6 inches to a foot before the low temperatures stop the growth this spring. It bounced back to life. I allowed it to grow to about 4 to 5 feet in height. Hot weather this summer terminated the cover crop. Now the only thing lives is grasses. My soil in that area seems to be much better retaining water. Live in the Kansas City area, and we are gardeners, not farmers. What should I do next? Gabe?
Okay. The principles that we use on the farm are the same as those for a garden. First thing, they're going to have to build some aggregation. I strongly recommend that most gardeners should think about alternating the space that they plant their vegetables in with plant the vegetables one year, a diverse cover crop the next year. This will give you the benefits that both Kent and David just talked about, same as we see benefits when we have diverse mixes on a cropland field. We're going to see them in a garden also. Diversity is best, and don't focus on one species. Make sure you have plenty diversity. Make sure you have species that'll attract both pollinator insects and predators. Now, ideally, you would like to have one large area and then split that. Plant your vegetables on one part and the cover crop on the other, because those beneficial insects will travel then from the cover crop onto and into the vegetable production, thus giving you the benefits of both. The diverse covers then are going to build the soil aggregation, the mycorrhizal fungi, and the things you need. Now, make sure that the species you plant in the diverse cover crop mix will be terminated by frost. So that will terminate that and allow you to establish those early spring seeded vegetables quickly.
Great comments, Gabe. Thank you very much. Anybody else would like to add anything else to this before we move on to the next question? Andrew asks, location is central Indiana. After silage, to prepare the field for fall/winter grazing, any recommendations for the best cover crop? Eric, would you like to address this one and allow David to follow up?
Let me look at it one more time, if you'd repeat it.
I can repeat it for you. Sorry, Eric.
That's all right.
Location is in central Indiana. After silage, to prepare the field for fall/winter grazing. Any recommendations for the best cover crop?
I'm going to let David take this one right off, and I'm going to follow up afterwards, because David and I have been working on some of these very same things. So David, you go first.
Appreciate that, Eric. So, you know, what's the next cash crop going to be? Is it going to be soybeans or what? That'd be my first question. But, you know, since silage is coming off early, you're wanting some fall winter grazing, you can easily go in there with, you know, spring oats or spring triticale. Typically, I've been leaning a lot more towards the spring triticale just because, you know, here in central Illinois and southern Illinois, we've been getting a lot more rust into our fall seeded oats that are sown after silage, just causing a lot of issues there on palatability and everything. So, you know, especially if you're focused on grazing, triticale is really great for grazing. You know, I'd be using, you know, maybe a blend of winter triticale, spring triticale. You could put, you know, some forage kale in there. You could put, you know, some turnips or rapeseed in there, some different brassicas. Again, we don't want to go overboard on the brassicas by any means. And if, you know, if it's going to soybeans, obviously you definitely don't want to put the legumes in there. You don't want to supply more nitrogen into that soil profile. So, you know, you'd be heavier on the grasses there. And, you know, if you're doing the grazing in central Illinois or Indiana, you probably want to have at least, you know, about 40, 41, somewhere at least between 40 and probably 45, you know, plants per square foot if possible. So your rates are going to be up there a little bit higher than if it's just straight for cover crop only. And I mean, you could, if you're comfortable with annual ryegrass is another great option to add into there as well.
Yeah, and I'll add to that from the grazing aspect. We've seen more and more people. We dealt out with Kansas this year. We're just turning cattle out and go to. I would really make sure you look at how you graze that as well. Make sure you're leaving them plenty of armor, plenty of residual on there, you know, and something like that, depending on what species of livestock you're grazing. I love daily moves, or at least moves every 2 or 3 days. But what we're seeing a lot is people using cover crops like that, and then overgrazing them, and you know, you've taken silage off the year before. So make sure you leave plenty of armor there, leave a lot of residual there when you're grazing it, preferably daily moves or twice, 2 or 3, you know, every 2 or 3 days. Would really make a big difference on where you go for next year.
Yeah. Andrew said he's going to soybeans. You know, I'd be looking at, you know, a 50-50 type blend between winter trit and spring trit. And the reason I like that spring trit is just like those spring oats, you know, they don't have to go through that vernalization period. So they're going to go off to the races. They're going to grow more in the fall time and provide more fall and winter growth for better grazing than just straight winter triticale would. And oftentimes I've seen a spring triticale in this environment over winter as well. So that could be a benefit to you. You could even use bob oats in there instead of, you know, the spring trit or whatever, but that's kind of a mix I kind of like to run with quite often. But I'd echo what Eric was saying on managing your grazing and try to move your cattle instead of just doing the Columbus style of grazing method out there.
Great comments, guys. So Charlene's question is, we live in Southwest Manitoba. We grew a cover crop on this field this year. A neighbor silage this week. It was a fairly diverse with oat, barley, pea, flax, vetch, turnip, radish, sweet clover, alfalfa, Italian ryegrass, and forage brassica. Will the cover crop have contributed to our soil health, or will have silaging it be a negative effect? We have really hot and dry conditions right now, so not expecting much regrowth. Gabe, would you like to address this one and maybe have Kent follow up?
Sure, be happy to, Shane. So the short answer is yes, it will have contributed a positive impact, even though you removed some of it. However, make no mistake about it, had that been grazed rather than chopped and removed, you would have been able to leave more soil armor, and it would have had a larger positive impact than if you removed it. So let's face it, northern environment, you're going to need to put up some forage. I do really think, though, if at all possible, even in northern environments, we need to be grazing these livestock for a much longer period of time, keeping them out on the landscape. We as producers in northern environments need to work it into our rotation where we're purposely planting cover crop mixes to graze in the late fall and winter time period. Kent?
There we go. Trouble getting the mute button off there. Yeah, Gabe's spot on. We need to do as much as we can with integrating livestock on these complex covers, but at the same time, sometimes we just have to do the best we can where we're at with what we've got. We know these drought conditions extend over a huge area. I'm hoping you can, retain what's left there and that you'll hopefully get some rain encourage you. Some of those plants may have an opportunity to regrow. Keeping a living root in the soil is so important as long as we can into the fall. It may be not enough regrowth for regrazing, but we can at least keep that soil covered, keeping the living root in there if we do get some moisture. So again, we sometimes have to do the best we can where we're at, and with the drought being tough, sometimes we have to do some things. It's less than perfect, but as Gabe said, in the future, if we can plan for using a cover crop like this as forage for direct grazing, we're going to gain just tremendous, exponentially tremendous benefits from grazing that versus taking it for stored feed.
Yeah, great comment. Both Gabe and Kent, the big thing is we understand, context. That's the reason why it was added. One thing, if we're going to make silage on some of these soils or some of these farms, we just want to alternate those areas around a little bit. Just don't be making silage off the same farms in the same fields year after year. Try to move that disruption around to different fields so we can give a chance to start building that armor, because that soil microbiology, as we showed earlier in the presentation, you work on the films of water, and we need to keep those soils covered as long as possible and keep that hydration in there so the microbiology can start working for us. Jim has a question here. South Central Michigan. I have always used gramoxin after wheat harvest, just prior to planting cover crop mix to kill broadleaf weeds and volunteer wheat. Is this a good practice, or I should be doing something else? David?
Well, I mean, when you look at trying to control some of the weeds out there, especially if you got a lot of pigweed or any of these noxious type weeds, if you're not grazing, especially, it just depends on how much is out there. When you look at gramoxone, as a herbicide, it's the only herbicide that has a skull and crossbones. Obviously it's not safe, right? So if it's harmful to us and we're more microbial than we are human, then it's probably going to have some effect on the soil. That being said, so do all herbicides. It goes back to kind of the frequency, intensity, scale, and timing of when we apply it, how much we apply it, how often we apply it, type of thing. Glyphosate, it, has its own baggage. But if you were to look at like a 2,4-D or dicamba, for instance, you're going to have issues there where you have plant back restrictions of upwards, of almost a month in some environments. It all depends on the rainfall and soil pH and stuff as that. But, that time that you're waiting to plant back, you could get another flush of weeds that come back into it. Oftentimes I've seen guys in Kansas, Eric and I were just out in Kansas. Shane, you were just down there in that part of the world here this last couple of days where we were in South Central Kansas, and some of those wheat fields, I mean, you want to talk about pigweed problem, they've got some serious pigweed down there. And, if you don't burn down that flush, it'll take over the field pretty quick. So, gramoxone, in my opinion, not too bad. Liberty is another option. It just depends on the humidity, on how well it will work. But then again, there are some issues of in some places they're seeing some residual tie up and affecting that cover crop stand. The benefit of the gramoxone is you can plant right after it.
David, one question we need to be asking ourselves: why are those plants out there growing? I mean, why are we seeing this water hemp? What are we seeing, this pigweed? I mean, what's it telling us? Can you explain a little bit, elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, there's a really good book this time of year I try to keep in my truck. It's called Weed Control Without Poison. It's by Charles Walter. But towards the back of that book has all types of different weed species, and it'll tell you, basically what that weed or that plant is telling us about our soils, whether it has an excess or a deficiency of some nutrient there as well. So when you're looking at like, a pigweed, it's generally due to excess nitrates in that soil profile. And if we look at wheat, we're applying, quite a bit of nitrogen on wheat generally to make yield. So we got that nitrate there. And as soon as, you know, those pigweeds are probably a little bitty about the time that we're cutting wheat. And then as soon as we harvest, it explodes. But we've got to be asking ourselves that question about all weeds in that soil profile. And a lot of times, you know, going back to even designing cover crop mixes, I'll look at what weed species are growing around, whether that's in the bar ditch or in the field or whatever, and look at and observe different plant species that are growing and try to mimic that with my cover crop mixes of, you know, maybe what's a cousin to that plant species that's growing, or plant a cover crop that has a similar root architecture, similar leaf architecture, but then also, you know, going back to what those weeds are telling us about that soil, we can identify what cover crops are good at bringing those nutrients up as well. So we'll want to plant those to try to eliminate that weed that we see it in those fields. The other thing is buy some cows.
There you go.
Eric, I think, has got his hand up. Eric?
Yeah, Gary.
Yeah, I just wanted to add just a little bit, you know, on my experience out in Kansas. I was blown away with their entire world. Seems like it centers around pigweed. And David and I met with a lot of different farmers that seem to be going the right direction until it comes to the pigweed. And I mean, the amount of chemicals, the amount of passes, the amount of mixes they were using just blew me away. And the fact is, there's nothing coming down the road that's going to solve this problem. So it was kind of a chicken and an egg thing. You know, they were trying to go down the road of soil health, but then they still had all this disturbance, you know, this chemical disturbance. So just a question to ask, you know, of what's going to solve that problem. And it's just like Shane said, you know, we do have to go down the road of soil health completely, because Kansas, you know, while that may not be the same problems around other parts of the country, out there it was everything. So just a good thing that I saw out there, and what you said about it, Shane, it really is a problem that's just going to get worse and worse.
Great comments, Eric, and observations. So Chris has a question here. Or excuse me, I've got a question from Corpus Christi, Texas. The crop rotation is cotton and sorghum/corn. There is heavy Bermuda and Eurasian blue stem weed pressure on all roadsides. Seems that everyone clean tills and leaves ground bare to bank moisture from late July through September until planting in mid-February. Any recommendations on introducing cover crops and no-till? Gabe, you want to start this one, and maybe Alan chime in on this question from Corpus Christi?
Yeah, Shane, and unfortunately, Bermuda is not my strong suit. I just do not work with it a whole lot, so I'm not going to be of any help on this one.
Alan, you're a Bermuda person.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm a Bermuda person, because I never plant or sprig Bermuda grass because it's not a great forage, to be honest with you. It's highly water dependent and nitrogen dependent and all of that. But I understand the question here. You know, he's talking about incursion of the Bermuda grass and in the blue stem into the crop fields. You know, basically here you're gonna have to outcompete it, and you know, initially you may need some herbicide to help you with this, but after that, this is where planting a diverse cover crop mix and grazing that mix can really help on control of these types of incursions and allow you to be able to get a foothold on them. So I would encourage, you know, looking at maybe some initial burn down options. And David, you know, you may want to comment on what some of the best options may be for that. But after that, certainly looking at an appropriate mix. And that mix is going to depend heavily on the context. You know, is the mix going to follow cotton? Is it going to follow sorghum, corn, soybeans? What is it going to follow? And if you're going to graze it, which I would recommend, then we've got to look at a mix that also is suitable for grazing and produce enough biomass for that. So, David, options on herbicides for controlling Bermuda grass and blue stem?
Yeah, so there's two parts of this question I was really wanting to address. And number one was the clean till and leaves the ground bare to bank moisture. You know, one of the things that we're doing in our Kansas project is we've got about 25 soil moisture probes out there, and we're monitoring that soil moisture down to the 4-foot level every 2 inches. And we're comparing, you know, clean tilled fields versus cover crops with residue. And it's amazing that with the cover crop residue, even though we had something growing out there all the way up through May when the milo was planted, that we actually have more moisture in that profile than the guys that do clean till or even just straight no till and do nothing but spray to keep all the weeds out. Their aggregation is horrible. They're not getting the water infiltration. So any of the rain events that they do get simply just run off. Now, yes, cover crops are going to use some moisture, but it's the management of how we manage that cover crop depending on our rain seasons there, that we can use that cover crop as a tool to manage that moisture as well. You know, it goes back to the principles of keeping that soil covered. When we do that, we keep it cooler. You know, just like you and I, we really like that 70, 80 degree weather. And once it starts getting up to 100 and everything like it's been, you know, we don't like it a whole lot. You know, we're not as active, and no different than when it gets down to, you know, 30 degrees, we're not as active as what we are when it becomes 50 degrees. So we got to think about ourselves as a microbial system as well, and how to manage our soils in that. Going to the herbicide side of things, you know, I've had some pretty good luck when I was in Oklahoma, you know, spraying like a half rate of, especially if Bermuda is creeping out into the field, spraying a half rate of Roundup onto that to just stunt it back, and then get that cover crop in there as soon as possible and to get it established, because that Bermuda grass can outcompete a cover crop pretty darn quick in there too. It's the same thing with crabgrass or foxtail. You know, if you get that established, and even going back to Jim's question there as well, those crabgrass and foxtail, they can release allelopathic chemicals, and even the residue on the surface can release those chemicals or those allelopathies, so that it inhibits the germination of other seeds. You know, it's amazing when we were talking about Kansas and the amount of pigweed pressure they have there. Well, any place that they have a heavy crabgrass infestation into a field, there is no pigweed growing in those areas at all. You know, part of it is that, hey, they're soaking up a lot of excess nitrates in that soil profile. The other part is it's just straight allelopathy, because I've got farmers that had tried to seed a cover crop into it, and they didn't get a stand one in that crabgrass. So, you know, we got to kind of set it back enough so we can get germination and get something established to grow. But, you know, managing that moisture into it, you know, if we're going to be planting, planting in mid-February, you know, that might be a thing. You know, we could either try planting green, or maybe we terminate it, you know, a month earlier to try to capture some of that rain and keep that soil covered as much as possible. And then that part of the country, boy, you've got a lot of opportunities to plant a lot of different species to build some biomass.
Absolutely. So Andrew is asking, referencing an earlier statement, you always hear for regenerative agriculture not to take forage off by way of hay or silage. Is that statement saying that with proper, and he says MIG grazing, I'm hoping he's referring to adaptive grazing, there is no negative effect from taking off the biomass? Alan, would you like to address this one, and I'll follow up, or Gabe can follow up on it?
I'd unmute myself here. All right, so read that to me. Okay, referencing the earlier statement. Yeah, first of all, we are talking about adaptive grazing, or I'm going to refer to adaptive grazing, not MIG, because there's a huge difference between adaptive grazing and MIG grazing. With MIG grazing, you are going on at a designated height, coming back off at a designated height. You have pretty much set acre paddocks that you're grazing on each rotation, and you have a set rotation. So you're trying to come back around again every 30 days, 40 days, whatever the case may be. And that is certainly not what we want to focus on there. We want to focus on adaptive grazing that allows us to be able to flex and adjust as conditions warrant, and also allows us to be able to achieve our regenerative goals and objectives. So in saying that proper grazing, there's no negative effect from taking the forage off, yes, that will be correct. If you are grazing properly, it actually benefits everything. It benefits the ecosystem. It benefits your soil biology. It benefits the plants themselves. You get greater plant species diversity. It benefits the animals and their performance and the wildlife. Grazing is absolutely necessary for having intact and complete ecosystems. That's the way that it has been for many millennia, with grazing, browsing, foraging animals existing on almost every corner of the earth. They're there for a reason. They are there because their impact is needed in that ecosystem for it to be fully intact. And grazing the forage properly through adaptive grazing is far, far different than haying or cutting a field for silage. That's a mechanical action. You have no biological stimulation or application from that. You also do not have any fertility application when you're haying or you're silaging. And in addition to that, we typically tend to cut it way too low. And the negative effects of that are that we heat up soil temperature, we lose a lot of soil moisture, and again, compounding cascading effects, we lose microbial impact, our aggregate collapses, all sorts of bad things happen with that, and we're removing a lot of our nutrients without putting them back like we are with the grazing. So grazing is by far favored over haying or cutting for silage.
Kent, would you like to follow up a little bit on that one? What Alan just said?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to step back maybe a little broader. Context is our first principle of regenerative agriculture, and context is going to dictate our management options. Yes, integrating livestock is definitely a regenerative ag principle, and at least disturbance is also another principle. But these all have to be taken in context. And as was stated earlier, in a lot of our environments, we're going to need some stored feed, whether for drought, whether for winter or flooding, whatever. We're going to probably need some stored feed. Stored feed's just another tool in the toolbox. So, but context is still first principles. The first principle. Ideally, as Ellen said, we want to graze. When we mechanically harvest, it's about nutrient and carbon removal, where if we're doing a good job of adaptive grazing, it's about nutrient or carbon cycling. And so flip side of that, poor grazing can be a negative or a highly disturbing factor out there with compounding and cascading consequences. So the how of many of these things is very important. Alan mentioned cutting height is very important, but again, all of this is going to be context driven, and it's going to change from field to field, farm to farm, situation to situation.
Thanks for your comments, Alan and Kent. Anna's got a comment here. We've got voles bad. Any suggestions? And I'm going to call on my only friend, Alejandro, to address this vole question. Alejandro?
Yes. Right, Jane. Yeah, we see any of those issues as nature trying to communicate something to us. Even, for example, grasshoppers eating the grass. There's a natural cycle of everything, and it also ties back to the previous questions where actually sometimes we missed all that manure cycle that not only comes from the cows, but also from all living organisms. And I think those that's telling us something. Those balls. I'm not sure what would that be, Jane.
So voles have a natural cycle of about 7 years, right? But the one thing I've noticed about voles is we've taken away a lot of fence lines and tree rows and things like that where the predators would habitat. So like a screech owl, I've heard, can eat up to 80 voles a night. So if we think about our cover crop management of that in that vole habitat, if we left that cover crop standing, those voles have got a tremendous, hiding spot there that they can go underneath all of that cover crop and be hidden from any of their predators. And the other thing is, the amount of coyote hunters that are out and about and killing a lot of coyotes, they eat a lot of voles as well. So I'd recommend not allowing any coyote hunting on your farms. But so if we can lay that cover crop down on that soil surface, now those voles have got to be up on top of that cover crop residue, and they're easier to spot by the hawks and the owls and the other things like that. Kent mentioned setting up predator perches and to encourage aerial predators, and I completely agree with that as well. I've got some farmers that are setting telephone poles up and perches all around their fields with different houses and things like that to attract those predators. The other thing is, when you really look at it, too many times farmers get to looking at a small percentage of their acres that might be damaged, and they fear that it's the end of the world. And, I was with another guy here a couple of weeks ago, and we're looking and talking about voles. And when you get a drone up in the air or something, or get over the top of a field and really start to look at the damage, or even just walking across a field and looking at the size of the damage from the voles, I think it was like a 40-acre field we were in. There was less than an acre that was actually damaged. So we focus a lot of times on that 10% or less that looks bad, and we forget about the 90% that looks really good. So sometimes we just got to trust that nature is self-healing, self-organizing, and self-regulating, and these things will work themselves out as part of the cycle as well.
Great points there, David and Alejandro. So, one thing. Yes,
yeah, well, something I want to add on that, on the lines of David, is we have a rancher here in Chihuahua where he bought a ranch, and he was wondering why there were so many rats across the ranch. When he started talking with the cowboys, they say, well, the previous owner told us to kill any snake that we see. And then he said, well, yeah, let's stop killing the snakes, and the problem was actually solved. So it's just amazing, just one species, how much benefit it could do. So if we just focus on what we want and just let nature raise it, self-regulating and self-healing, it will do it a lot of problems we see right now, most of them are tied to the management we're doing.
Yeah, great point there. Thanks for sharing that, Alejandro. You're absolutely right.
Shane, something else I just thought of too is, we've talked a lot about grazing on the cover crops, and when we're doing adaptive multi-paddock grazing and focusing on stock density there, those cows will tromp down those vole tunnels, and you don't have those problems nearly as much, and that actually works better than a roller crimper.
Those are all great solutions, and I mean, I like to think we want to focus on one individual problem. We're not addressing the core issue, and that's something we need to acknowledge. And this is a cover crop presentation, question and answer, and we've got some of the world leading experts about cover crops and regenerative agriculture here this evening. And David, I know we address a lot of guys' questions and people who call us frequently. How to start? How do we start? We're looking at harvest here in the next 30, 45, 60 days throughout a vast part of United States here. And guys, we see it all the time. It's nothing but a corn soybean rotation, and we understand that's not going to change a whole lot, even though we'd like to see a third rotation added into that. But how does someone start off, David? Let's say we're taking off corn and we know we're going to go back to soybeans. What's just the simple thing we can do once start getting our toes wet here of doing a cover crop, something we can be pretty highly successful with to build confidence?
Well, first thing is, you don't have to put the whole farm, as much as I'd love to see the whole farm, do with what you're comfortable with and that you can sleep well at night. Push yourself out of the comfort zone enough that it makes you a little uncomfortable, but start small enough that you're comfortable with it, and manage it so you don't have those failures. We mentioned early on about the herbicides. That'd be the first thing that we need to understand is, what herbicides have been applied so we know what cover crop to be using, but then what are our resource concerns and our goals? We have to understand what keep it really simple is cereal rye. And you don't have to go at 100 pound an acre or anything like that. A 40 pound rate, will help to really increase tillering on that rye plant and to help to suppress out a lot of weeds. And even if you don't allow it to get 6 foot tall, it can still help with a lot of those winter annuals that we fight. And take up a lot of that excess nitrogen that's in that soil profile and can help us fight the weeds going into the future. Now, going after soybeans to corn, it's a little bit more tricky. The common thing I see in the I-States is oats and radishes. It's like the only thing that we can plant. Well, as we was looking at that carbon to nitrogen ratio chart earlier, there's a lot of things that we can plant. It becomes a timing effect of when is that crop going to be harvested. If we're really wanting to provide some nitrogen benefit and use the legumes and everything after soybeans, we might think about planting our soybeans earlier in the spring before corn even, and shortening up our relative maturity so that we can start harvesting in September. Couple benefits on that is, number one, you can get that cover crop established better. But number two, you've got longer days there and a greater window to be able to harvest those beans instead of waiting until October when you've got, shorter days and you might only be able to harvest maybe 4 or 5 hours in a day. You've got almost all day that you can harvest beans in September, and you can knock out a lot of beans in a hurry in September timeframe. But understanding that carbon to nitrogen ratio going to corn is huge, especially starting out. And a lot of times we get guys that will say, well, I planted this cover crop, but my organic matter is not increasing. Well, organic matter, when you're looking at that on a soil test, is one of the most variable tests that a lab performs. And so, they take that sample out of the bag and they run 5 different samples on it, and they'll average them out to get your organic matter. But if you're burning down a cover crop at like 6 inches tall, if you do the math on that of how much carbon is in that cover crop, how much carbon is released out of that cover crop residue as CO2 into the atmosphere, and actually what goes back into the soil, you know, it would take probably, I think Ray Weil in the Nature's Property of Soil, he claims that it takes 42 years to increase 1% organic matter if you're burning down that cover crop at 6 inches tall. And think about the amount of biomass that's there. You know, it might only be 500, maybe 1,000 tons an acre, you know, compared to a 6 foot or 7 foot tall cereal rye crop that could have, you know, 6 to 8 tons an acre that you're laying down. Tremendous difference right there of what we're building there. But, you know, to go back to the question, Shane, is, you know, keep it simple, start with what you're comfortable with, add that diversity to that cover crop mix, and, you know, change your maturity so you can get things in a timely manner is really critical.
Yep, I agree with you totally, David. Keep it simple and, you know, start your learning curve and, you know, and confidence and move forward. So Lance has a question here for us. Several growers in my area have experienced an increase in slug damage with the use of their cover crops. Most that I speak to want to continue using covers and building soil health, but they want to know if there are good options to deal with slugs they are seeing. David?
Yeah, so a lot of the slug issues are just due to the wet springs that we've had. But the other thing is I have to ask is like, how are they planting their cash crop? And, you know, are they using neonic insecticides? Are they spraying insecticides as well? And, you know, are they burning down their cover crop early? Those slugs can live in the soil for quite a long time, just like a snail. I didn't know this until recently, but a snail can live in the soil for up to 7 years before, you know, the conditions are right and they'll express themselves. The slug's basically the same thing, the same way. And so if we only are planting the cover crop and we burn it down early, and then we plant our cash crop into it, and our cash crop's the only green thing out there, they're going to attack the only green thing out there. Now, if we're planting green and we've got other vegetation growing, well, they've got a smorgasbord to choose from. The other thing is, as we add more diversity into that cover crop mix, and we start attracting these predator insects, you know, crabbed beetles, lightning bugs, different spiders, you know, tiger beetles. These things are ferocious consumers of slugs. But, you know, there was a guy in I seen a picture from Southern Illinois, and he planted half of his planter with treated seed and the other half with naked seed. And the slugs devoured or fed on the treated seed and not the naked seed. And, you know, from what I can understand is that, you know, that slug's not dumb. And he actually will go after that treated seed plant, even if he just crawls across the surface of the leaf, he gets that neonic on him. And as soon as that crabbed beetle or lightning bug or whatever takes one bite out of him, he falls over and starts, you know, to convulsion die. And those insecticides, they don't affect, you know, the lightning bugs or anything like that in the neonics, you know, directly, but they do affect them when they do eat the slug. So it's really interesting to see how nature is actually, you know, performing out there and what's happening. I think it is Professor John Tucker from Penn State did some research on slugs and said that after they removed the neonics and the insecticides, that it took 3 years for the crabbed beetle population to be high enough to actually control the slugs in their plots. Gabe?
Yeah, that's John Tucker at Penn State. And we do have in our resource page, we have some very good reference materials on slugs and how to address them. The other option for people is, you know, they can move and come farm in North Dakota. slug isn't going to stay alive in this weather.
That's your unfair advantage, Gabe. So anyhow, Martin has a question here. Planted a summer cover crop mix, grazing it now. I've heard and read some people saying you should only allow the cows to eat the top 2/3 of the plant. But I've also heard people saying you should allow them to go lower, like in total grazing. Planning to be able to come back to grazing in 5 weeks. So, there's some great research and great information out there, showing once more than 50% of that plant vegetation is eaten, it has a very negative effect on the roots. So basically the roots quit providing carbon, feeding our soil microbiology, which is helping build aggregation in our soils. So now we kind of basically stopped our feeding stream once we graze past 50% to the soil microbiology. Also, the recovery time of that vegetation is going to be also hindered and take much longer to recover. Then another factor to all this is once we graze past 50%, the nutrients within that vegetation decline dramatically. So now you're looking at possibly having to supplement my animals by overgrazing. So it's kind of this negative cascading effect that Alan refers to quite often. That's the reason why we've got to understand proper grazing. It's more than just the animal nutrition. It's also how it affects the plant species itself and also how it affects the soil microbiology. And Kent, would you like to elaborate any more on this about the grazing aspect?
Yeah, we want to think about what are our goals, for that stand. If we're trying to build soil biology, if we have multiple goals to build soil biology as well as feeding the livestock, we need to, think about what Shane just talked about and how much we're consuming. If we've got weed control goals, if we want to start moving towards a no-till system and use some of that crop residue as a mulch, we need to leave enough of it out there. I think so often in agriculture, we think about how we get an ROI for that year, but in regenerative agriculture, we try and think about more long-term goals and addressing multiple goals on the site. And as Shane described, when we take 50% or less, we can achieve multiple goals. But if our goal is only to feed livestock and we want to get the most tons per acre off of it, we can go that direction if we choose, but there's going to be some negative compounding and cascading effects.
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Kent. Anyone else like to elaborate a little more on that, or?
I'll just say real quick, we graze summer annuals all the time with grass finishers, and no doubt, having done this for quite a while, that it is far better we typically don't like them to take more than 30 to 40%, to be honest with you, especially on that first graze. You get much more rapid regrowth and you get a lot more grazing events, during the active growing season with that. So it truly is far better to not let them take more than 30 to 40% on a summer annual, particularly when you have like BMR, sorghum, sudan grasses, and millets and things like that in the mix.
Thank you very much, both Alan and Kent. We got another question here from Ann. Any thoughts on the best way to manage cover crops in a wet spring? Gabe, would you like to address that one first?
No idea.
Gabe has no idea about what a wet spring is like, so. But I'll tell you what, Gabe, give it your best attempt.
All right. So did she say there whether they were grazing or was she talking about seeding?
Best way to manage cover crops in a wet spring. So I'm assuming what Ann's referring to is that they're already planted last fall. And probably I'm assuming they're going to be managed to plant into, but let's address both, rather than maybe planting into that and or possibly grazing it.
Well, that's the beautiful thing about cover crops. And I've heard it say, if you're in a dry environment, you need to plant cover crops in order to increase your water holding capacity and give you more resilience during those dry years. If you're in a wet area, you need to plant cover crops in order to build soil aggregation and increase your water use intensity in order to use up some of that water. So one of the things I think we need to take into consideration here, if you are in an area of the country where you are more often than not dealing with some wetter conditions in the spring, you need to increase your water use intensity. In other words, plant those species that do have higher water use requirements. And so species such as cereal rye, winter triticale, they're going to use a considerable amount of water, especially if you let them get to a little more mature state, such as anthesis. If you have a wet spring, I would wait to seed your cash crops until those cover crops get to that anthesis stage. That way they're using up a bit more of the water, and it will allow you to get better seed to soil contact on them. I would also suggest, if you're in those type of areas that are seeing an abundance of rain, to look at planting some warm season cover crops also, in order to help build that soil health, build those soil aggregates, so that you're able to move that water throughout the soil profile. And I will contend that no, it's not about tile drainage. It's about building soil health and soil aggregation. David?
Yeah, so one of the things I've seen a lot, in Southern Illinois and in the previous years, and especially, that I-70 corridor this year, is that we were incredibly dry all the way through April, and then mid-May it started to rain, and then it started to dry out again, and then in June again it started to rain through July here. And one of the things that I've seen is that the cover crops can hold your equipment up really well. And so a lot of guys don't realize the moisture of that soil profile. And so if you were to go out there and let's say mid-May or one time in there, and you think you've got to plant your crop, we really need to be digging in that soil quite a bit and see if we can ball up that soil in our hand. If it ribbons out really easily and kind of slimy, park the planter, just wait. Another thing with this year, we had 3 days in late April that the nighttime temperatures got really cold. That stunted the rye back pretty hard, and a lot of the other species as well. And so, the anthesis was kind of delayed on that, and guys that tried to roll or crimp couldn't roll or crimp until it was after anthesis stage. But at the same time, that early planting, really there's what I seen was a 10-day window there where if a guy planted early, it had to be replanted because it sat there in wet soils and just rotted the seed. This later stuff came up fine, not a problem. And then the replanted stuff got hammered by rain again in those wet pockets, and those crops don't look real good right now. And realize that if you look at some of the neighbors replant, they probably don't look good either if they've been conventional tillage. And you go out into those fields that had cover crops in them, and there's a tremendous amount of moisture in that soil profile. I was in a field just yesterday down in Southern Illinois, and because of the armor they had on their soil, they had a tremendous amount of moisture in there. Go across the road to the neighbors that was fully conventional tillage, and same amount of rainfall, but there was hardly any moisture in that soil profile. So much of it ran off. In that part of the world, they're always about, the going saying is we're always 2 weeks from a drought. So if we're thinking about that, this is just one of those years that, hey, it's wet. But if, like Gabe said, we give it time, to allow those cover crops to soak up as much moisture as possible, delay the planting, and just live with that. Later planting dates is better than trying to push the envelope and plant when conditions just aren't right.
Yeah, great point there, David. So, well, I think we're going to call it an evening. We'd like to thank everyone for their time and their questions. We'd like to make you aware of our upcoming webinar, Building Resiliency, back into your soils, your systems, your farms and ranches. We understand there's a major drought going on in our country. One thing we unfortunately see throughout, no matter what part of where we're located, doing consulting and working with clientele, is bare soils. And soil temperatures today down in south central Kansas, we were pushing 144 degrees soil temps. So underneath armor, we were around 88 to 90 some degrees. So that's a considerable difference. So how do we start building this resiliency back into our soils? And understanding the Ag webinar series. So we hope you can make it August the 19th. We appreciate attending this evening and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.